Hi, everybody. I thought I'd do a presentation on Hans Georg Gadamer. I can say at the beginning, I didn't realize how difficult it was going to be to do that because his thought is pretty complex, but also worth the trouble. I thought I would begin by making an attempt to justify this choice. And also to give a little context for its application. Uh, First off, it's for a class that we're doing, a philosophy class, where we've spent some time looking at the major figures in the history of philosophy. And then more recently, we've looked at some uh, better known contemporary philosophers, which included, Cornel West, Peter Singer, Martha Nussbaum, and Judith Butler. And there was still a kind of gap before our our class comes to an end, so I thought I would like to include another contemporary philosopher. I think I can call Gadamer contemporary. And so that's what we're about here. Just as a kind of background for it, Gadamer has been on my mind for a while, but a couple of years ago, I'd watched a video of him doing a reading of Heraclitus and found it pretty fascinating. I remember at the time I shared that video with a few friends, but I didn't pursue the interest specifically. Most of all, I was kind of interested in Heraclitus, but I was also very much interested in the way that Gadamer was looking at Heraclitus. So Heraclitus, from the pre-Socratic philosophers had always been an interesting figure, I thought, and in part, I want to say because of the way he was taken up by the Stoics later. But I mean, and the kind of series of qualities that were attributed to reality in Heraclitus's thinking. The idea of the logos and the idea that the logos is reason. Then you add in the logos as reason is also fire, or the metaphor of fire, and also kind of represents the divine. So to bring all of these qualities together as Heraclitus did was a pretty captivating idea. And the final piece of it was that we as human beings have a share in each of these qualities, and the logos, the reason, fire, and the divine, that there's a bit of the divine fire in each of us. So I was very much interested in Gadamer's reading of Heraclitus, and in particular the way that he did the reading. And it encouraged my interest and enhanced it even more. Taking a look at Gadamer a little bit further, I began to see that there was more to him than just his reading of Heraclitus, but that there were some pretty positive qualities that came through in his ideas. I've made a short list here, but to start with, I'll say there was, at least as far as I can tell, in the later Gadamer, there's a ethical quality in some of the things he says, especially in the indications that he gave in terms of what's needed for us in terms of our relations with one another. It seemed to me that he was encouraging a kind of interested openness to the other, which was an interesting idea. And secondly, I'll say another positive aspect of Gadamer's thought was that it contained a defense of the idea that some more robust sense of the truth could still be sought and arrived at. Not an absolute truth, of course, in the modern era, especially, but clearly a rejection of the idea that you could choose whatever version of the truth that you wanted. And just because you believed it, that would be true. So he sort of left open the possibility still of some sense of truth that could be obtained. And my last observation about what I was gathering from Gadamer, anyhow, is that his philosophy really had a kind of traditional feel to it. That's a little ethereal, I know. But when I think about Gadamer and I compare him with the list of contemporary philosophers I just mentioned previously, living philosophers, it seemed to me that Gadamer somehow represented a traditional point of view, but not necessarily in a negative sense, but actually that in a very positive sense, that Gadamer kind of still took what was good from the past, took what was good from the classics, and brought it into the present. And this idea of striving for a more holistic sense of the truth and embracing the ancient model of the Socratic dialogue were aspects of it, both of which seem to be pretty positive. I've included here a few references or resources that one could turn to if you wish to pursue the study of Gadamer further. I mean, his major work is Truth and Method. And that's a difficult text and a lengthy text. I think it's about 550 pages. So wasn't required reading for this class that I'm recording this for. But I mean, I just wanted to put it up there anyhow, and as a suggestion. I've asked the class to look at a couple videos. The first one is Gadamer by Jessica Frazier, which is a St. John's Timeline video. I like that series a good deal. And it's a pretty good general introduction to Gadamer's philosophy. Very nicely done presentation. Then the video that I referred to earlier of Gadamer doing his Heraclitus reading. That's I don't think who it is that does it, but there's a series of videos under the heading Philosophy Overdose. And so I'm just putting that there, I mean, as something else that the class was asked to look at, the specific study of Heraclitus. The one difficulty in approaching Gadamer is that I don't know to what extent he might speak English, but all the stuff on the YouTube videos and so forth, they're all Gadamer speaking in German, so you have to have a translator translate everything. So that's not used to that, but I mean, and I know a little German, but not enough to translate the spoken word. So there's two videos from this philosophy overdose, and one is shorter than the other. I mean, I think the translator translated a certain portion of it and put that up, and then later translated the longer version of the lecture and then put that up as well. I mean, for our class, we've just looked at the shorter one. It's about 20 minutes. The full-length one is a little less than an hour, but we have limits in terms of the time that we have for this project right now. Would like to comment a little bit about Gadamer's life, his specific interest and influences on him as well. Let's start by commenting on his lifespan, which, if you looked at his years on the opening page of this presentation, said what an incredible life he must have had, and to live to be 102 years old. I can't think of another philosopher who had such a long life. And he had because he was born in 1900, he had a lifespan where he had a life that spanned the entirety of the 20th century. Imagine all the changes that you would go through in such a life. And still, at the end, as far as I can tell, he was intellectually active. There are some videos of him in his 90s giving talks and so forth. So it's an incredible life that he had. Wanted to include at least his interest in the Greek classics. And this was an interest that would sustain him throughout his life and stay with him. As Jessica Fraser put it in her video on this subject, the classics remained for him a kind of anchor throughout times of difficulty, something he could always turn back to, that he had this love of the ancient Greeks, and this included all the ancient Greek philosophers, the pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Heraclitus, which we were focusing on, I mean, it's just one example of this interest. And then lastly here, I mean, the philosophical influence of Heidegger on Gadamer's own philosophy was profound. Gadamer was still a young man. He was just 23 years of age after he had finished his study of the classics and had written his dissertation on that subject. Gadamer went and joined a circle of young and gifted students who studied with Martin Heidegger. I think that was in 1923. Gadamer was 23. Heidegger was only about 10 years older, and still kind of on the rise in terms of his own career. I don't think at the time that Gadamer went there that Heidegger had his full professorship yet. But he would go on to study with Heidegger and others. I mean, Husserl was also there, and all these young students took classes or did studies with all the available big-name philosophers who were there. I think it's just in Freiburg. So he learned as a result of this and was influenced in the direction of phenomenology. Husserl was the founding figure of phenomenology, learned about hermeneutics and existentialism. Excuse me. And apparently it's hard to note details, I mean, historically, personal details about people, but it looks like Gadamer was pretty close had a pretty close relationship with Heidegger. It's impossible to talk about Germany in this time period, and Heidegger in particular, without commenting on the rise of the Nazis. As I said in the last slide, that Gadamer began his studies with Heidegger in around 1923. So it's not very much longer. I mean, so in the interim, the Nazism has been on the rise, and especially, by the 1930s, it was a pretty significant political force. In 1933, Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, and the Nazis were in a position of power. Life dramatically changed for everybody. Shortly after Hitler's ascension, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party and became the rector of the University of Freiburg. You'd say that's an astonishing series of events, to say the least. I think we could safely say, what was he thinking? And if the truth was known, I mean, he was thinking some things, but, almost unbelievably so. After the war, in the defeat of Germany, Heidegger downplayed his involvement with the Nazis. And those who were a lot of kind of apologists for Heidegger, who sort of bought his version of how things had gone. But gradually, it came out that he had actually been more of a sympathizer than previously believed. So it's like such a peculiar circumstance where such a major philosopher should become embroiled in a political party like the Nazis. So at best you could say Heidegger was a mixed bag. Gadamer, there was pressure on everybody. I mean, during the time of the Nazis being in control, there's pressure on everybody to take stands, and sort of there was pressure on Gadamer as well, but he kind of resisted this call to action, and by all the accounts, it looks like he kept his distance from his teachers, Heidegger's political involvements, and tried to find ways to even be critical of Nazism in his lectures. You could say he offered a kind of passive resistance. After the war, there would be repercussions for those who embraced the Nazi leadership, which meant Heidegger was banned from teaching for a certain period of time. But Gadamer came off looking pretty good as a result and was given positions of authority in universities as a result of it. I've tried to make a list of some of the major ideas in Heidegger's philosophy. And the first one has to be hermeneutics. Originally, or generally, you might say that hermeneutics is the science of interpretation. To begin with, it was a discipline that was used to interpret religious texts, scriptures, like the Bible. You'd say especially after the Protestant Reformation, in which Martin Luther had advocated everybody reading the Bible for themselves and determining what it might have to say about how they should live. That the question of interpretation, how to interpret the Bible, became a significant question. As time went on, gradually hermeneutics would be broadened to include interpretation of text in general. Or, for instance, you might be interested in interpretation of law. So you have laws, but there still has to be interpretation of how to apply those laws. So hermeneutics kind of evolved to become interpretation of text in general, and could even be broadened further to be the interpretation of the text of the world, or the text of world history. How do you read that? How do you understand it? How do you interpret it? Eventually, it becomes a kind of philosophical hermeneutics, and which broadens the field out even to a more general level. How do we determine what's true, or what has meaning? Or you could say, how do we determine that? How do we actually determine it? Or how is truth and meaning to be determined? For Gadamer, in general, we could say that we interpret all these different kinds of text in accordance with our own intelligence, our own lights. And we do that kind of interpretation in conjunction with others through the conversations that we have with them. A second idea that's important in Gadamer is the focus on language. This is, well, a lot of these ideas were ideas also brought by Martin Heidegger, but they had, lives of their own as the ideas went forward. So language, especially in the 20th century, gradually became the central focus of philosophy, or what people were interested in trying to understand. You could say, what is language? And what's our relationship with language? In a way, I think what is going to be determined is that language is something, this is Gadamer now, language is something that's always already there. It's not to be viewed as a tool that we can make use of, although we might think of it that way, but really it's an aspect of who we are and how we relate to reality. Gadamer cites Heidegger, who provocatively stated that language speaks in and of itself. Gadamer, this is sort of difficult subject, I think. Gadamer uses the idea of play as a way of explaining or trying to understand what our relationship with language is. Or you might even say, how we inhabit reality in language or through language. He uses the idea of play as in games. If you play a game, you say the game is a shared activity and it has a definite set of rules that the players observe. That's what the game is all about. And each of the players contributes to the play of the game. And their individuality is maintained, but together, everyone, all the participants, contribute to a kind of dynamic new reality that emerges as a result of the play of the game. Heidegger wants to say that language is like this. Language is like a game that has rules and regulations, and that we're all participants in this play, and it's part of how we inhabit reality. The third idea, major idea, has to do with the truth. And maybe you begin to see, as a result of our going through these, that these major ideas, hermeneutics, language, truth, they're all interrelated, and trying to understand the ways in which they're interrelated, what impact they have one on the other. You could say truth is not something that anyone can determine on their own. It's not determined as a solitary individual. There is a kind of still a relativism involved with respect to the truth, but not in all respects. It's not total relativism. You could say, if we're trying to determine the truth, as always, everybody comes to the game, again, a kind of game, from a certain place, or from a certain set of situations. They come to the game with attitudes and prejudices. So always, already, there's something predetermined there. Everyone has a certain history, certain situation. But still, we can move towards truth or allow truth to appear as a result of the interactions, the discussions, the conversations, and so forth that we have. And truth can emerge in a kind of gradual way from this, even though everybody comes from a particular historical background. If you have conversations with others where there's a kind of who are also interested in this search for understanding, and everybody plays the game, same set of rules and regulations, that something can be arrived at which is independent of the particular individuals. So dialogues can result in a blending of all the various horizons involved if the dialogues are open. So dialogue is the fourth basic idea we want to comment on, and the last, really. And dialogue is, for Gadamer, is going to be the primary way in which we can determine meaning and truth. Now this is, we take dialogue kind of in the sense of Socratic dialogues where you have a give and take, question and answer, where you gradually kind of refine your understanding of what it is that's in question. So here you could say that something like this is taking place. Each of us, it's a little repetitive here, but each of us begins, so to speak, with our own frameworks within which we live, our own horizons, as Gadamer expresses it. And the aim of the dialogue is to have an exchange. I mean, is to say what your point of view is, but also to listen, and learn from the other. To listen and to be willing to learn from the other. In other words, you can come from your own perspective, but there has to involve a willingness to change or a willingness to alter your thoughts, your views in a way. So listen and learn from the other, and the expectation is that the aim would be the same for the other, that they also have their point of view that they might wish to express, maybe even argue for, but they're willing to listen and they're willing to learn from oneself. So you have this back and forth, common interest is pursued, the advance of a kind of understanding, or the enhancement of a kind of understanding. Gadamer, in one of his lectures, cites this quote from Hegel, which is pretty dramatic, where he says that Hegel says, education means the ability to see things from the point of view of the other. So that's interesting. And Hegel, we don't have time to do too much in Hegel, and we didn't really address Hegel in our class this semester, but Hegel is, everything is a kind of dialectic in Hegel, that there's always a kind of a thesis and an antithesis, two opposing positions, and that one seeks a synthesis of the opposition. So you say an advance in understanding is you bring 2 points of view together, and the aim is to rise above the opposition. And if you find a synthesis, you rise above the opposition, but you still have contained in what you end up with. The synthesis still contains what was true in the thesis and also in the antithesis. So you can see that's probably the nature of what a dialogue is you have two different points of view brought together and exposed to each other in a kind of sense of openness. So this quote, education means the ability to see things, the willingness to see things from the point of view of the other, to include that. And you could say, and I think Gadamer would say this, that this is what is most needed today. And he would acknowledge that what is most needed is also the most difficult. We need to be able to listen to each other. We need to be able to learn from each other. That's what's needed, but it's difficult because we're all so entrenched in our own particular viewpoints. It's hard for us to listen. It's hard for us to be open. It's hard for us to learn from each other. You could say, in at least two cases in the contemporary world I can think of, in here in the States, race relations. What's most needed is conversations about race. But it's like people find that like the most difficult thing to do. You could say, or else you want to have conversations or dialogues about religion. But people find that most difficult to do. It's hard to be open to different views, but again, it's what's most needed. And so it's a challenge for all of us, I believe. And as Gadamer says, what we need in this lifetime is to get along with one another. And in order to get along with one another, we have to be willing to listen to what the other has to say and be willing to modify our views if it's shown that we should.